So really, basically, we've got discussion time now. Questions, responses. Yep.
Can I ask Norbert a question? This concerns a couple of your compatriots from Arizona State who have just published a white paper on reflective roofs and pavements. And whilst they see enormous benefits, that is cooling the planet at a dramatic sort of rate, they also noted some unintended consequences. And I wondered if you were aware of those. You mentioned one, which was glare, but also there are medical effects connected with a lot of glare, especially from reflective pavements, perhaps not so much from reflective roofs, through optical effects and potential cancers, for example, over the long term. The second effect was changes to local precipitation, which in a desert is a bit of a problem. Any comment on that?
I do not know about this particular research. I do know that some Stanford scientists argued that it has not the benefit that physics would suggest, but most of the scientists seem to think that using light colors is better, and unless proven otherwise, I still think so. It's true that photovoltaics will change the color of the roofs. Eventually, they'll even change the color of the walls. We'll cover the walls too. But that's a much more expensive strategy, and I'm not against it. But, you know, money is always a problem, and so until we can afford that, let's go with the free, actually better than free. You actually save money initially and continually. Let's use white as much as possible. So I'm glad you brought that up, because there are always unintended consequences.
We humans are famous for it.
Yes. But the danger would be to say, well, we can't do anything because there's going to be unintended consequences. So we have to try things and see what happens. By the way, I've never heard that Casablanca has a problem, a health problem, because of the whiteness. And there are also some villages in small towns in Greece that are all whitewashed. In Bermuda, the law requires roofs to be white. So far, none of these places seem to have health problems that I'm aware of.
A lot of them have very narrow, shaded streets.
Yeah.
Interesting.
With the white walls.
So this heat wave effect is important. In Australia, we know the Victorian bushfires, which were a Black Saturday, and there were 173 people that died from the bushfires, but there were 480 odd people that died from heat wave that caused the bushfires. And then if you go on to Wikipedia and look at catastrophic deaths in Australia, apart from shipwreck and the odd plague, it is in fact a series of heat waves.
And we don't talk about it.
We don't talk about it. Well, that was buried until the Royal Commission into the Black Saturday bushfires came out about the statistics of who died as heat waves. So it's a very important thing.
A little ironic aside, during that terrible heat wave in Europe, in France, they had to shut down some nuclear power plants which were located on rivers because there was not enough water, plus they were heating the water to a point where it would endanger the aquatic life. So nuclear power is not always the solution to preventing climate change.
I'd just like to make an observation about the art and science of city layout. You know, city layout doesn't figure in our planning document or our planning system at all, really. But, you know, in history, of course, it's been a really important, probably the most fundamental part of city development. And so it's the art and science. Like through the 19th century, let's say, the engineers like Serta in Barcelona or Light in Adelaide or Mitchell in New South Wales towns used primarily a a square grid, I should say, for lot subdivision reasons and a range of reasons. During the 20th century, of course, we had, you know, dead worm suburbs and curved streets and cul-de-sacs, all based around the motor car, street hierarchies, or road hierarchies, as Tone well said, just about road engineering. So if we were to treat the art and science of city layout based on Norbert's principles, and we really valued energy consumption and creating effective buildings, that would change the layout of the streets. We'd have east-west streets, and it would be a really important consideration on the part of planning and development and, you know, everything that goes into making new places. And it seems like we don't have that conversation at all. You know, engineers lay out streets still, or roads, without taking into account the things that Norbert was talking about. They just don't value it. So I think that needs to be put into the mix much more.
Can I just comment on that, Russell? Because when I graduated into a recession, which young architects never heard of, look it up in a dictionary, I had to go to Canberra to get work, and I ended up working for the NCDC, the National Capital Development Commission, although in those days we used to call it the No Can Do Club. And one job I got was to redesign the suburb of Chisholm, which had already been done by engineers in, I love your term, dead worm roads. And could I reorient the blocks so they would always face north-south so that you get what Norbert was talking about? And I worked quite hard on this thing to prove it could, and then the road engineer said, yeah, that's very nice, let's have a drink. But what was more, I think, more powerful was, at the same time, I went to a meeting of the Solar Energy Society there. There was a number of people making presentations, and at the end of it, one of my friends at the NCDC, Russell Womby, introduced me to a local architect called Laurie Ver. Many people, V-I-R-R, I don't know if you know. Absolute legend, phenomenal architect, did amazing work. Very difficult man, though, so his reputation is more about him than the work. And Laurie said, oh, I'm building a house. And both Russell Womby and myself were entertaining the idea of designing houses. We designed houses for ourselves. And Laurie then unrolled this roll of drawings of the most amazing looking house. It was a hemicycle. It was based on the Jacobs house by Wright, the second Jacobs house with a hemicycle. And he'd positioned it because he'd bought the worst oriented block in Canberra, which is one of the worst suburbs. And his idea was the proof of design was that you didn't need the engineering rules, you could design out of it. And he'd worked out a way of putting the hemicycle to get the sun and put the triangular towers, it was a pure Wrightian, on it. And Russell and I both looked at this, exquisite drawings in pencil on vellum, you know, just, yeah. And we both looked at it, and we both went home, and we both said to each other the next morning, did you tear up your drawings? And I did. That house actually exists in the archives. The first drawing I made, I got an approval for it, but I never built it. It was horrid, because it was based on an engineering idea of it, and Laurie was showing me what a design idea might do to respond to it.
Did he build it?
Did he build it?
Oh yes, he did, and it's published in a number of books, and just recently there's been a book on great houses in Canberra, and it's not a thin volume. I heard that. It's quite a good book, and his house is the only photographs I know of that house, and it is exquisitely built. The master carpentry and master bricklaying in it are of another era of what he did. Yeah.
I think one of the other things interesting, when I was at university, we all had sunshine and shade in Australia.
Yes.
We all
had
those weird
little,
sunshade, ugly things on windows and all the rest of it. But we all learned how to orientate the buildings, but we never talked about streets and urban design. And the modernist thing was you could have streets that didn't really relate to buildings. So you had buildings like some of those higgledy-piggledy things. They all orientated. They didn't create a place. And now we've come the other way where we're saying the street is the place. We're really obsessed by urban design, and I think now we don't look at sunshine and shade in Australia. I don't think when we're doing design that we link up building orientation, street, place, together, they're almost two separate things. And I'm not sure how the teaching works at the university at the moment, but looking at those two things together, I'm not sure how that works, to be honest.
Philip, this firm has done two perfect examples of that. Work that was done by Philip early on in Woolloomooloo that did address the street and was all about the street pattern. And at about the same time did a scheme at the gateway to Newtown, just near Queen and King Street.
Yeah.
Exactly, and the street runs at an angle. Yeah. And it was a cause célèbre at the day that we railed against this failure to recognise urbanism when solar was dominating. It dominated the pattern, and yet we were solar-bred architects.
Well, I remember the original Olympic Village design where you had Hill Thallas did one layout, Rod Simpson and Hill Thallas had a great debate about whether the street should go east-west or not, and how to best orient the Olympic Village. And I think it's a matter of having that debate between people who have the emphasis on solar performance or in energy performance and others who, value the urban layouts for other reasons. But I think that's what we don't have that debate these days, it seems to me.
Do you think so? I think Philip Thalos is holding that debate together over Barangaroo every time he speaks.
Okay.
And I think Philip's been our greatest advocate for a street pattern that recognises urbanity and solar and climate.
In Australia, particularly with that project, is that Lend-Lease took it over and they changed the street pattern, but they sold it as a sustainable development. Anyway, but the sustainability was because they had solar panels, it wasn't to do with the orientation, and from that point forward the street pattern has gotten lost, and unfortunately there are urban designers and there are architects. It's almost like you're preaching to the converted, but it gets lost because the developer comes in and says, well, we can change the orientation and we can whack a solar panel on and we can put air conditioning on, and that's what's happened in Sydney.
But was it economics that drove it? Because historically we had all these wonderful street patterns that were just straight lines and grids. And you think of suburbs like Paddington and Balmain, the streets lead you straight down into the water, but they're steep streets, so perhaps it was harder to build.
As we went to suburbia, we evolved from a Victorian street pattern.
Did we go? Well, why did we go to suburbia? Why did we go to those dead worm streets? I reckon it was because it was cheaper to build. Because in drainage, in road drainage, and it comes back to the road design.
It wasn't cheaper to build, it was an ideal. It was the garden suburb. It was the ideal to move out of the city after the Industrial Revolution. People didn't want to live in the cities, like in London, with that city. It was definitely an ideal. The garden city evolution came to Sydney.
To me, that doesn't explain why we went from grid streets to worm streets.
Because of the garden city movement.
That's a good term, worm street.
Absolutely, but it did because of the...
That's what we're going back to now.
We're bringing the conversation back to the core proposition, which is streets that are orientated in an interesting way. I think, 2 points. Firstly, of course, topography is a critical issue, particularly in Sydney, and that really, in terms of the way we lay out our streets, etc., we're responding to ridge lines and slopes, etc. And Paddington is, I think, a really interesting example. And I think Philip's point about the road reserve and the actual relationship between buildings and the way that they interact to shade each other and create pedestrian environments within a street that isn't about the car but about a peopled boulevard or laneway is important. But when we talk about unintended consequences, thinking a decade and a half ago or thereabouts, I made several trips to China, and it did what you proposed. It has street patterns that are orientated in a certain way. It has slab buildings that are north-south, and the urban consequence of that is catastrophe. It's horrendous. It's inhuman. My question, my question to you is: have you been there? I think your ideas are great in terms of principles and so forth, but we need to we need to deal with contingent reality, and we need to take these principles as designers and architects. Obviously, we need to acknowledge them, etc., but we need to kind of bring things back to, the reality of the cities, etc., that we're working within. And this building is a classic example. Our windows are on the east and the west. You've got to make do with what you have. And I think coming back to Tone's point about, imagination and design and dreaming, etc., it's about the creativity in dealing with a set of principles, be they based on science or engineering, etc., but then coming up with the creative solution that solves the problem. But getting back to China, in terms of the pure, deliberate execution of the ideal, do you have any comments on
Yeah,
that?
I've been challenged like this before, especially by master planners. When I was still teaching at Auburn, I was on a faculty committee to oversee what the master planners were doing. And they had a plan with buildings in very aesthetic locations around the campus. And I said, if they were oriented in east-west direction, they would be much more efficient. And the planner, and there was a whole committee of them visiting the campus from this famous firm, Sasaki. They said, well, that would be ugly if all the buildings were lined up. And I told them, well, I grew up in New York City, and all the buildings are lined up, and it was wonderful. It's not the street orientation, and it's not the lined up which determines whether it's humane or not. It's what you do with the buildings. And there are beautiful streets in New York, and the streets are straight. It's actually very efficient from an engineering point of view. If one street gets blocked, you have 100 others to go by. Many of these engineers' plans are much worse. They all feed to one main feeder, and if that gets blocked, everything comes to a standstill. So the grid has a lot of advantages.
The best bits of New York are where the grid fails.
Blocked,
It's where Avenue Americas hits whatever's at Fifth, and you get the Flatiron building, or south of Soho, south of Houston, where it jumbles up. Having interrupted, I just want to answer your question about the snake or the worm streets. The answer is Lord Holford. It's probably not a name that you know, but most of Canberra was designed originally by Griffin, and it was gridded. And it was gridded on a northeast. In fact, what's interesting is how much of Griffin's scheme was a solar scheme. The scheme that runs between Civic and Russell is actually oriented to have 3-storey walk-up flats that would face northeast, which in fact in Australia, and particularly in Sydney, is most propitious because you get the early morning sun. It helps warm up in the middle, but it's also where the summer breezes come from, predominantly. So this was a very good pattern. When the NCDC was formed after the Second World War, Lord Holford was brought out from England. And he'd basically been studying the idea of townscape, a kind of perverted version of Cullen's townscape, of the attractiveness of the curved road from the motor car, and there were no junctions, no crossroads. And the way to do it was to have T intersections. I can see David Honk.
You can't blame that on Cullen.
I
don't think you can blame that on Cullen.
Well, no, I think it's a perverted view of it. It was the kind of picturesque view, and they turned it into curves. I mean, Cullen was all about small villages and how you would see things.
Pedestrians.
Sorry, sir?
It was also to do with safety, like to be in the suburbs, to have your children playing at the end of a cul-de-sac. It was safe, secure. That was my understanding, that the cul-de-sacs evolved from that idealism of living in the suburb, away from the city, and the cul-de-sacs were linked by greenery.
We find it really difficult to convince councils that they should have little rear lanes to get the density up in townhouses. The rear lanes were dirty. They were where the refuse went. It was.
They're regarded as slums.
Yeah, they were the slums.
Which is the other answer to your question: is the turn of the century federation wasn't a change of style. It was ambitious middle-class councils like Concord, Mossman, and so on, didn't want slums, so they invented a subdivision of a 1/4 acre. which would prevent the building of a terrace house without the back lanes, which were full of refuse and badly dressed children who was...
Disease, plague, like
Yeah. Because,
all the rest.
Tony's idea is, well, you introduced the passive language and stuff, and where design is and architecture is about solving problems, and it's about nutting out these different. Like there are a series of strategies that have been proposed, and they're all good strategies in and of themselves. But actually, as has also been pointed out, they don't really work on their own, and there are lots of examples where they don't work. And the architect's job, and the designer's job, and the design team is to take those things that they're kind of good ideas, but try and work out how do you make them work in this place. And on your list is passive solar design, which is one of my great kind of bugbears. And passive solar design is an incredibly complicated, difficult thing, and most of the time it simply doesn't work. And I know everyone says it does work, but actually, especially in Sydney, it can work, but then the window, often the window's too big, and so it overheats, or there's too much thermal mass, and so it gets too cold all the time, or there's not enough shading, so you have to get it right, and you have to get the orientation right, and the street plan right, and you have to get all these things right, and it's really hard, and that's why we're architects, because solving really hard problems is a lot of fun.
Sorry, this was going to do your job for you. I see Andy Marlowe wanting to say something off the back there.
Yeah. It is hard. Like, the principles are simple, but depending on how you came from, there's 7 of them. So 7 variables trying to balance isn't exactly an easy thing. But I think you're wrong saying that it doesn't work. It doesn't work when it's done wrong. Yeah, but you started with the phrase, passive design doesn't work.
Right, I'm sorry.
Okay, that's an incorrect.
Yes. It's true, it does work, and there's
when done well. So.
Yeah.
Can I raise a question in regard to, and it's really for the locals, but Norbert might have a comment. In terms of policy, when you look at the orientation issue of a north-south orientation, and then we take something like CEP 65, that drives, rather than a north-south, it really drives an east-west orientation, and it's an interesting question and dilemma, and it's going to drive our urban typology over the next 20 years and beyond. What are the comments?
Well, I think it's about economics. All of this is about economics. In an ideal world, if you took out the current economics, you would have many east-west streets, and so therefore probably a higher percentage of public domain to private domain than what you currently get in a typical subdivision. But also you'd have slenderer buildings. You wouldn't have 24-metre deep buildings, with what happens now is buildings that are oriented north-south with apartments on both sides of a central corridor, which just scrapes in the 2 hours in the apartment design guide onto a square metre of glass. That's what you can get by with now, but if you were actually to make it more effective, you would have east-west oriented buildings which would be 12 metres deep or something like that. So that's why I'm just making some general comments, but if you could do the slenderer buildings and the more streets, you'd have a far better environmental performance. It'd be more expensive.
You look at the RFDC and its progenitor, the ADG we now have, and Jacques Le Corbusier. Every page looks like it's been ripped from the Unité d'Habitation in Marseille, which is a off-white building and very successful in that light. No, it's off-white. It's gone grey, like Corbusier and myself. But the thing I think is interesting about that is that Sydney has a much bigger cooling problem in apartments than it does heating. By dint, it gets high thermal mass from what you were saying, and I think that's what Andy's talking about, because the nature of having to make them acoustically and fire separated and so on, you get the thermal mass. The real problem is that it's easy to heat those, it's not too hard, and we'll learn to do it in a solar hydronic way, but keeping them cool is the difficulty. And just recently we got knocked back on a building where we're trying to do a little bit of the unité again. You remember the chimneys that are on the top? We had chimneys with controls inside it that would allow you to cross-ventilate the apartment even though it's internal, through silence air, through boxes that would allow air to go into this shaft with a small fan on top, and you could cross-ventilate it at any time, day or night, particularly at night for night cooling. And the Director of Planning for the City of Sydney says no. And we marshal troops, including scientists and engineers, at court, and they simply say no.
Because they don't like the look of them.
Because they think cross-ventilation is what they learned in second year in the 1970s. It's a big window over there and a small window over there. We've moved on from that. It's about night flushing. It's about thermal. Passive thermal is the ability to be able to get air into the building at night and flush the heat out. And they don't recognise that as cross-ventilation. There's no definition of it in the AGG, so you can't win at court on it. Sorry, that was it.
That's a good example of a building like that in Madrid by FCP Studios. Basically doing what you're saying.
I think this comes back to the problem that Maria talked about. Because things aren't open source, a lot of clients don't want to spend $20,000 modelling something, and if you're on a design review panel and they don't spend all that money, people kind of make things up because they want a big fat building, they don't want cross-ventilation, and you actually don't know how it performs. When you look at computers and big data, you can do a lot of stuff for nothing, really, but the way it works with IP and all of that, it's not shared. Like at Green Square, you were talking about the flood problems. I've been on quite a few City of Sydney juries. Every time you're reinventing flood modelling. Well, how come? It's been done, but it's been done by one set of engineers who own it. So I think you can't actually, when you design, you can't really see how your building performs. Bruce and his team at Kinesis do a lot of work on things like precincts where we're trying to merge models to try and see how a building really performs. But here's, one proprietary system, another proprietary system. It's not open source. There's no way of, because the savings will be massive overall, but it doesn't work. In the United States, a lot of stuff is open source. And in Australia, almost nothing is open source.
Oh, Philip, so I have a solution for you.
So I think there's a lot of issues.
Isn't it called government, the answer to that?
The answer to it is a new computer program called Sapphira. Anybody here use Sapphira? It's based on 3D modelling inside the computer, and what it does is it robs every other single program around the world. It goes to Building Designer, it goes to Energy Plus, it goes to all of these places, and it's open sourced in the sense that it's already loaded the BCA, the Section J, all those codings, and it's not hard if you talk to Josh Cates at Sapphira to get models from others. It's becoming more open source. I'll give you mine, if you like.
But I think the thing is, we've got things like...
Sorry?
We have licenses. But they have to go into But they have to go into the... But they have to go into the planning system, because there's no point having that and then going to the City of Sydney and they go no. Whereas if you do basics, because it's part of the system, you do your and I'm not saying basics is good or bad, but you do it and it gets accepted. So how do you do these things so they become accepted? It's not just a great big long argument, and that you can actually see how your building works, which is, it's the modern version of the solar protractor, which is the urban, all those things were just houses in green fields that were fairly simple to model, relatively. Now we're in an urban situation, it's more complicated to model, and I just don't think we're there.
What did you want to say?
Well, I was going to say, because Sapphira it's very clever because it allows you to kind of model your building as you're designing it. So it's kind of it's a sort of computer with your pencil in your sketchbook, because that's how I design. Instant feedback. But then once you've got to a certain point, that if you want a high-end modeler but that's free, then you could use Open Studio, which is a Energy Plus plugin to SketchUp, and it's actually really straightforward to use. And then you've got the world's kind of most tested energy modelling program free on your free SketchUp. So you've got free SketchUp, free Open Studio, and you can go to the City of Sydney and say, here's our model. And I'm sure if you, some Part 1 student or whatever they call
So
them,
that's
Australia.
3D, let's go 4D, let's go 5D, let's go 10D. So we talked about Central, down at Central Park, Broadway. So the underground issue around the water access, and could we actually have cogeneration? What do we do with the steam and the water? No one in the government utilities was coordinating what's below the ground. So in your world, it has to be, 10D plus. You have to be getting information sources and making decisions each time. But you must get feedback about performance, because you leave a building, you go to the next project, and you don't go back about what do we like, not like, or change.
You have to go back and look at
the whole, just to go and see all that information put into a tool, people are talking 10D.
Yeah.
Whatever that is.
Yeah, I think road.
Well, you have to go back and test the building, and go back the next year and for after 5 years and say, did it work?
And
if we don't go back and say, did it work, then we'll never learn anything.
Yes, and then when the refurbishment happens, adding that data and information layer. So that's a complete revolution of governance, because why should it be private information with open source? I don't understand.
I think the governance has got a lot further to go than designers.
The ethics of who owns data and everything, yes.
We have a 20-storey building we're doing at the moment, which we want to be white with horizontal sun shading on it. And the city has said, no, you have to get the basic performance out of dark glass.
What?
And vertical fins. And we said, well, actually, you can't legislate for the fins, because basics takes care of all of that. And that does not mean that the director of planning can actually put something into a consent, which is completely illegal, because they can't actually add anything in there that has to do with energy or thermal performance, but he's dictated the form of the shading the building must have. So that's the atmosphere in which we work, Norbert, is that they banned white buildings. Because white is, for all the reasons that you mentioned, everything that's about it, they would like them to be more colourful and to have a richer, how many people have heard richer colour palette? Or soft, earthy tones.
Articulation through colour.
You wrote it, Russell.
Isn't the colour thing, there's that weird idea that it was the sandstone city and brick, and so you have to have this kind of terracotta-y thing, which is kind of daft, because everyone drives white cars because they're cooler, but we can't do it with buildings.
There we go.
Also, miles cheaper
and cleaner
in a city of pollution. It's pretty dreadful after a couple of years.
About how you prosecute the argument. We're doing a building 25 stories, probably 200 metres from here, and we demonstrated to the City of Sydney with live modelling, with a raw nude building, what the thermal outcome would be, but then we actually showed them different ways of shading and how we drew the shading or modelled the shading live or animated it that demonstrated the best thermal, the best environmental outcome. So the architecture, in a sense, was a pure and direct result of a very simple passive environmental intent, and they understood that.
You're using science and mathematics to prosecute an argument that in the past has been done on the basis of opinion and subjective criteria. And I think increasingly that's what's going to happen, is that we have the tools at our disposal to use the science and maths to prosecute that, the myths of it, the myth of over-glazing, for heaven's sake. Almost every solar house that you find in the books of the 70s is hopelessly overglazed. They are designed for North American and North European ideals. And it wasn't until we had some reasonably sophisticated tools that you could actually demonstrate, and people would say, well, yes, actually my house is incredibly warm in winter, but I go down the coast in summer. And I think that tells you a lot about the rules of thumb which have been handed down, and some of those which have been handed down on tablets of exquisitely executed mild steel as being the Australian house, being full of windows, when in fact it works much better if it's got very selective openings to it.
I'd like to take this advantage to plug heliodons again. And I want to be sure that everybody understands I'm not making any money with this. It's just that I am a true believer. And you mentioned that the code people or the building officials want you to put fins in. The only vertical fins, the only place where vertical fins are effective is on the south side of the building in the southern hemisphere. On every other orientation, they are useless.
But wouldn't you say that modern computers, Norbert, that allow you to make a movie of it, transitioning the sun over the building, does the same effect of looking at real-time performance in different seasons for a young architect, a student, a young architect, can see the passage of time in an animation on a TV, on a screen rather, shows you how old I am, on a screen. That's going to be much more powerful, I think, because they're screen trained. They want to see the movie. If it's not on YouTube, it's not real.
I don't disagree with you, but why is it that the building official thinks that fins are the right answer? I've just written the fourth...
It's a subjective visual thing.
I just wrote the 4th edition, and I hate to admit that in my first edition I wrote a lot of things that were wrong. And one of them was fins on the east and west. Because, why did I do that? Because all the other books said that. And
because
it just goes on and on and on.
Victor Augier and his Design with Climate in 1963, which is one of the great texts, yes.
Not until I started using the heliodon and started looking at what actually happens did I discover that it's wrong. There are a lot of myths in what everybody thinks, the engineers including, think is the right solution. The computers are potentially great tools if you know what to ask the computer to do. But unless you have the right background to understand the general principles of solar geometry and solar strategies, you're not going to use the computer effectively. That's my opinion.
Can I have the south side of my building being entirely black if I put fins on it? So it's not white.
You put white fins on.
Oh, I put white fins. We're starting to talk about fins as if they're some kind of additive like motor cars of the 1950s.
It's what you said about computers is interesting. We just got students at UTS to draw their project by hand. We told them they couldn't use a computer, which you can imagine in the first week caused a little bit of a problem. But actually, by the end of it, after 5 weeks, they almost all said that they'd learned lots more from drawing it than using the computer. So I think the heliodon and the cardboard model, and when I go to clients, I take a cardboard model because they can pick it up and the heliodon's great, but people mostly don't have heliodons in their living room, but they can go outside and they can move the model around and they can see all the light's doing. And it's incredible what a pencil and a cardboard model can teach people. And then the computer kind of refines it.
Let me just add one more thing. You're right that computers could simulate all of this, and really we don't need physical models at all anymore. But if you look around in this office, you see physical models. Why is that? The computer could do just as well in explaining it to the designer and to the client.
I think you just answered that question.
I'm not sure a computer model could do. I mean, I agree. There's nothing better than a cardboard model to explain a concept or the detail of, how a fin might work in terms of a shading intent. Or models are absolutely important,
and there are
as is a pencil sketch on a piece of yellow trace.
I mean, there are wonderful we need
to use the full range of tools at our disposal. The sort of absolute high tech, but the absolute low tech as well. It's all part of the range of tools that we have to use.
When you're looking at a 3D digital model, you're looking at in 2D on a flat. We had studios at UNSW yesterday. Only half the students made physical models. The ones that didn't have physical models, you couldn't actually understand the scheme, to be honest. They had a few still shots of whatever, and you couldn't actually tell what the thing was like.
You couldn't pick it up and turn it around and look what was on the back of it.
You really couldn't tell, and I don't think the student quite understood what they'd done. So it's still a 2D picture. It's not actually a 3D model.
I think it's the best test of a young architect. Sorry, just finish this point. That you get them to make a model, and it tests out whether they read the drawings, whether they understand it, and whether they improve it as it's being made. It's the first thing.
But can I just move us to like the future? I mean, really, there's a robot in Western Australia that is building a brick building every 2 days versus 4 to 6 weeks for labour with, you know, autonomous cars which are coming, this robotic design. So unless you automate this, I'm sorry, but even Lang O'Rourke is using Betsy, the robot, to be building facades today. So in the next 7 to 10 years, you'll work with your hand sketch, good on you, but really, are you going to be part of what is our future, which is an automated world?
Because for Betsy to build the facade, someone needs to have designed that facade.
Yes.
And the way that starts is by sitting down in a room with a client and an engineer and like a team, and you have a conversation, and that conversation normally starts with the pencil.
So last week, and that's why
Apple have just brought out their big tablet. With
so last week in UTS, you stand in a room and it's one, you know, it's 360 degrees, and the data is fed in, and you're designing right there with everyone, every engineer and every designer, and every city code and every bit of information being fed in front of you, and people are standing there with the 3D glasses, sorry to say, and interacting and designing, and I didn't see pencil. So I'm not saying that Joe's point about a spectrum is not there.
Yeah, I had that same image with Rob Sitch.
I'm absolutely saying that your future will be disrupted unless we move. Your future is disrupted.
It's about agility.
Yeah.
And it's about ideas, and it's about imagination. It's not about tools. And it's how there's nothing, from my experience, there is still nothing more agile than a pencil to explain and communicate a concept or an idea. But as I said, that doesn't preclude all the whiz-bang technology. We should embrace and use all of it as deliberately and as imaginatively as possible. But, you know, we should still use traditional tools. The perversity with the robots that you're talking about is that they're building buildings in a very automated way, but out of brick. Now, what is a brick? A brick is a module that's about that big, and why is it that big? It's about a human hand actually constructing a building. So my question in regard to robotics and the construction of buildings is, well, the whole module that you're working to has got to change. Yeah. It's not, there's a perversity in a robot doing this. The robot should be kind of doing
Which is the 3D printing is building rooms right now, and buildings the next thing. So I'm not saying we don't do the pencil. I'm just saying that we have to do one end of the spectrum, and we have to absolutely get collaborative and share and have open source information.
The challenge for the profession of architecture is taking hold of the whole delivery aspect to buildings through the whole shop drawing process, etc. I mean, in a sense, we're heading back to the medieval period, you know, the master mason period, where the architect was really central to the whole construction process. I think so, and indeed, if you look at firms like Shop in New York, where through technology, the whole way we deliver, the way we collaborate through BIM programs and so forth, is just recasting the relationship
no project manager,
between.
Joe?
It's recasting the relationship between architect, engineer, client and contractor. It's a whole new world, and it's all really very interesting, and it's forcing the kind of collaboration and open sharing that, you know, we've talked about today. So
it keeps striking me, you know, you get a whole lot of architects in a room, and what do? They talk about buildings.
Yep.
We're meant to be talking about streets, and I tell you what, I've never seen a model like that of a street and how you design it. You don't see, the students do the same thing. They still go, you know, 50 years later, they still go, so this is my building. And you don't see how they relate to each other. And I mean, the whole thing of orientation and street colour, you know, Michael Mobbs tried for years to get that little street in Chippendale white, paved in white. And there's a huge fight, and it's still kind of, now it's kind of half grey and it looks miserable. But, you know, we're still making black roads everywhere, and we're still making streets that are probably oriented wrongly from what we sound. We're not, and it's interesting how our minds drift off that, and I suspect maybe it's because architects actually don't design streets. They design buildings, and developers are still designing streets. Is that right?
Developers. We've talked about our building models.
Yeah, yeah. It's always about the building. That's how
I'm trying to remember if we've modelled streets.
Yeah, yeah. Does that even happen?
Oh no, I don't even
there was that amazing
I don't
book.
think engineers or even planners are doing it. I think streets are the accidental result of putting buildings together. You know, we revel in the idea, because you were touching on this, Joe, the idea of personality and individuality within the buildings. But I don't think anyone really consciously is doing the street. And certainly at Barangaroo, that was absolutely thrown out.
But that's how it should be happening. It should be the Nolly map. You know, that's the figure you're designing.
That's, to go back to Philip Thalis and Paul Birkmeyer and Jane Irwin, that was their vision for it, was to design the streets and let 1,000 flowers bloom along the streets if you control the scale.
The great proposition that they had was, it was the great strength in their scheme, as we've discussed previously, was it was a very simple subdivision plan, you know, with everything that's positive that's embedded in that idea, including multiple authorship, multiple ownership, etc.
The thing I couldn't understand is that Paul Keating, who thinks of himself as Baron Haussmann from Paris, couldn't see that it was in fact a very Haussmann-esque idea to design the streets. So that's one example I could give of somebody, I think, doing it consciously, but you're right, there's precious few.
I was curious about why planners weren't designing streets the way I thought they should. So I decided to go to the library and look in some planning books. And I just went to the index to look for words like orientation and sun. I never found it in any book that I looked at.
Look at Alberti.
It's not an issue that is discussed in planning, it seems.
Planners don't do planning anymore. not in New South Wales anyway. Yeah. So, anyone else? Are there other?
Look, I'd just like to. This is just a thought I've had recently about trying to get solar into apartment buildings. Now, you know, the simple answer is the apartments get sold, and so who wants to build solar panels for, you know, apartments that are going to get sold by a developer? But is it really only that which is stopping us? Because, you know, when you see marketing plans for apartments, they have, you know, the size of the apartment, 75 square metres, one car space plus, you know, balcony of 12 square metres. Couldn't they have 10 solar panels on the marketing plan? And wouldn't people start to value the fact that there was 10, they could buy 10 solar panels just like they could buy one car space? So that's just one thought. The second thought is, you know, the black roofs on all the suburban houses we see across Sydney. Everyone wants black. Why? Because it looks good. Couldn't you sell a house by saying, look, it's actually got a white roof and this will save you so many thousands of dollars in the next 10 years and put that on the marketing plan? I mean, why not? I'd be interested to know if anyone's got a thought.
Well, definitely white. Let's start demanding it, so it should be a premium. With the photovoltaic cells, it is essential that it becomes part of this is what I want. So I love sacrifice of car. But the whole design, if you're talking high rise or low rise, there's an issue about solar panels. Can you get 10 if I'm in an apartment? No. But am I buying it in Western New South Wales, for example? I don't know. So I think that the street that I think architects have the opportunity to is that, well, why do I need a dining room in my apartment when I could rent on Friday night, because it's only like once every couple of months, I'm going to have people over, and I've rented the dining room down the road or in the building, depending on the street. Why isn't that part of the collective, collaborative design of apartments as well? And I think really that is starting to happen, but you can't do it in one building alone. You need to have a block and a street that is actually defining that these are all the different types of diversity that I have to choose from. Yeah.
I think young people are doing that. They do.
Yeah.
They have birthday parties in, you know, restaurants and pubs. They do all that stuff.
Yes.
Quite
If you ask
easily.
them, if you ask the millennial, they don't want the car, they don't want the dining room. They
transport.
They want
the access.
In Melbourne, which won all the awards last year by Breathe Architects, has done that. So they've got this fantastic communal space.
Yeah.
It's very sustainable. It's right on the railway line, so it addresses all of those issues. It's a really great project, and hopefully that sort of
The Commons. Yeah.
the Commons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's really really.
Yeah, I just want
Community housing in Hong Kong, that's incredible.
Yeah, they've been doing it for years.
Yeah.
I wanted to tell one little story by way of saying thank you to Norbert. Philip mentioned the sunlight and shade in Australasia earlier on, and when I first went to the United States to do a study on what was then called autonomous housing, everywhere I went, particularly I was based at UCLA, but I went in the southwest, people would say, oh, we've seen your book in Australia. You must have lots of good solar housing because we've seen this book by Ralph Phillips or R.O. Phillips on sunlight and shade. We just turn it upside down and we use it for the Northern Hemisphere. Why are you coming here? We should be going to you to look for... I said, well, there are no solar houses that I know of, and so I've come to see yours. So I spent 6 months there studying and went back to Australia, ran out of money, moved home with my parents. My mum took an interest in what I'm doing. I said, I'm doing solar houses. They're going to be, you know, self-contained and autonomous and lots of solar. And Mum said, oh, maybe you should just go across the road and talk to that nice old man, Ralph Phillips. And I had grown up in the same street with Ralph Phillips and had never known. I just thought he was this weird old guy with a funny beard who had this solar thing on his roof. So there is a thing about travelling the world, but also staying close to home. But so thank you for your very, very...
You
erudite
reminded me of, I'd like to make one last comment. Most people associate solar with collecting, like passive solar heating, but I'm actually convinced, seriously, that the main value of solar responsive design is cooling, and cooling by rejecting the sun. Because most people on Earth live in hot climates. And by designing a building to reject the sun, you actually save more money than you save by collecting the sun in most parts of the world.
Yeah. Good point. It's just not as exciting, is it, to save energy as to do something like have an SPV on your roof.
It's kind of counterintuitive that rejecting the sun would be so valuable. You know, you kind of automatically think you should be collecting it.
Well, I think all you need to do is actually ban air conditioning for 10 years, and all of that would come back. All of the orientation, the colours, and the eaves, and the insulation would all be back in moments, and we'd have to reinvent Moorish architecture, you know, in order to survive.
Conditioning. Building conditioning would replace air conditioning.
Yeah, indeed. So, are there other comments? Is there anyone still dying to ask, say, reject?
I was just going to try and ask, what can we conclude from this? The things I've heard tonight are, without open source information, we're wasting huge amounts of effort, and we don't actually agree anything between authorities and proponents. The focus of all our tools is on buildings, not on streets or the other environments. And nobody thinks about getting the heat back into the sky. I don't think like that ever, to be honest. What are the other things that we think have come out of tonight? Can I ask people?
Joe's question about Beijing at all, and maybe we need to wear the special glasses to enjoy Beijing.
Like, is it tolerable?
The other thing that's coming out of the sessions we've had is the strength of economic forces. I don't think we think about it very often, but when you say you get something for free, like a barangaroo or something, you might save some energy, and that might be 0.5%. But if I can get 5% more floor space at $35,000 a square metre, that's value. It's not for free, it's what I'm getting. And I think a lot of what we do is about land values, return. Dwellings have now become an investment. They were a dwelling, but now they're an investment. And when you're a homeowner, you're the dweller and the property developer. And I think that change. Those examples you've given don't sit in that environment. So how we do these things in our economic environment, I think is a question. I'm not sure what the answer is, but I don't think we think of that.
Well, one way is to educate the public and the homeowners and the people buying the homes that if they buy a house with a white roof, they're going to come out ahead. But most people don't know that. And the question is why, and I've asked this question and I've never found an answer. Why is it that most people in the United States, and I guess here and many other places, think that black roofs are better looking than white roofs? Why is that?
It's a very good question.
Because it's more enclosing, because a roof is cosy.
And they don't stand out from the green trees, which is what people like to see.
Yeah. But I've lived in white roofed houses, they're fine.
Well, I think that aesthetics is very much based on experience. That people grew up with dark, maybe because slate or asphalt shingles, and it just, what they're used to is what they consider beautiful. And it's a trap. It's a...
I'm sure that's right.
So I was just going to say, I work in the operational side, so I'm in the sustainability team with Jones Lang LaSalle. So we get gifted all these wonderfully designed buildings that then, you know, we have to deal with the parts that break down, or the black water treatments that don't actually do a lot of help to the building, or the tri-generation that just fails. And I guess from this, it's really exciting that there's a lot of focus on passive design and just, you know, changing the dynamic of, you know, sizing your equipment and that kind of thing based on those principles. And I think a lot of our engineers would be very excited to hear what you've come up with about, you know, in these areas. So, yeah, if it continues down this track, we'll be very happy building managers. So, yeah.
Good. Low tech. All right, well, let me just say thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you to our wonderful speakers. Thank you, Norbert, Maria, and Tone. That was fantastic.
And we have drinks here.
And we have drinks.
Have a chat. Discuss this. Most welcome.